is the Agency Profit Podcast, the podcast for agency owners that want to run a more profitable business that doesn't depend on them. Introducing your host, CEO and co-founder of Parakeeto, Marcel Pettipaw.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Agency Profit Podcast. I have got a real treat for us today. Joining me on the show is the former founder of one of the largest and fastest growing digital marketing agencies in the country. In 2004, he founded Rise Interactive, built and sold that, and today offers world-class agency-specific financial management, accounting, and virtual CFO services to agencies. Joining me today is Jon Morris. Thank you for being on the show with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Marcel. Really excited to be here.
Likewise, we have had a chance to nerd out, as I like to say, several times before the recording of today's show. And, the minute that we had that conversation and unpacked a little bit of what we do, I said, I've got to have you on the podcast. And here you are. But before we jump into the topic du jour, I want to give you an opportunity to, in your own words, describe what it is that you're up to and who you serve.
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, I founded Rise Interactive in 2004. Had an amazing run, was on the Inc. 500, 5,000 list for 9 years in a row, had all sorts of different recognition. But a big part of the way that we got there was the way that we organized our finances, the way that we did budgets, the way that we put our strategic plans together. And what I recognize is that for smaller agencies that are looking to scale their business, this is one of those things that they don't really think about. But if they get it right, they position themselves to be in such a better position to grow at a much more rapid rate. Mm-hmm. So created Ramsay Innovations with the focus on helping agencies really creating world-class infrastructure to help fuel and scale their business.
And so I want to start with the origin stories of Rise. How did growing that business kind of inform the specialization that Ramsay Innovations has today? What were some of the key learnings that helped you realize, like, hey, this is something that other agencies need access to?
So I'll go through a couple of different ways. One of the things I always found fascinating was talking to agency owners and how little they invested in sales and marketing. And, I had a couple sayings. One thing is it can't be a goal unless it's in your budget. And so, the idea that so many people tell me that they want to scale, they want to grow their business, but then they don't put anything into sales and marketing. I literally had a sales pitch last week where someone told me that they want to turn their agency into a huge company. And then I asked them, what do they spend in sales and marketing? They said zero. And I challenged them and I said, look, I don't want to be, disrespectful, but I don't really think at this stage you want a huge agency, because if you did, you'd be making the investments. The other thing I say is everyone has a strategic plan, whether they know it or not. It's what you put your money into. And so when I gave my little overview of how I formed Ramsay, I kind of skipped a couple steps for speed. But the reality is I started off with an executive coaching company. And I was coaching anybody and everybody. So I was coaching interior design companies, to life insurance companies, to a cannabis consulting company, to agencies. And when I was talking to them and I was going through the program to teach them how to scale their company, what I found was that the financial acumen that we were bringing them, the budgeting process, the forecasting process, the cash flow analysis, that was the kind of the glue or the secret sauce that no one seemed to really have right at the smaller stage. And so I don't think I realized at Rise how much of an advantage we had from a financial infrastructure until I started talking to more people. And so we pivoted, and then we decided we're going to go all in on agencies and we're going to go all in on finance management. And that's kind of how we came to where we are today.
Well, I'm glad that you did, because in my opinion, I've said this before, I'm on, I guess, a mission to have every accounting firm that specializes in agencies on our podcast here. But I don't think I don't think there's nearly enough that are solving this problem because the market is absolutely starved for true expertise that is specific to this business model, because there's nuances to this business model that general accounting typically does a bad job, in my experience, of creating value for the owner and their executive team in the actual numbers that are being reported. There's just so many things that they can't see unless there is some intentionality applied. And I'm excited to dig into that a little bit more. I want to come back to something before, though, that you said, which was this notion of, where you put your money is your focus, is your priority, it's your strategic plan, and people, choosing or not choosing to put money into sales and marketing. And I think what's funny about that is, to you and me, that probably sounds like a completely reasonable thing. But in my experience, and I'm sure you've had this conversation a lot as well, somebody is kind of appalled at the idea that that is a choice that they can make. And it's like, well, it seems like that's not a choice for you, because maybe you've been choosing to put your money into subsidizing your clients, or subsidizing poor scoping of projects, or subsidizing poor culture around managing projects, or over servicing clients. Therefore, it doesn't feel like you have the cash available to invest in sales and marketing like you want to. But the reality is, this should feel very much like a choice. Is that your perspective, Jon? Or talk to me about how somebody gets there.
It absolutely is a perspective. I'm going to give you a few different scenarios and a few different stories. So I have a couple clients that are both PR firms, both in the same market, both have similar customers. One of them spends 7.5% of their revenue on sales and marketing. One of them spent $51 last month on sales and marketing. And the person who spent $51 in sales and marketing is actually very proud of that number. And what I explained to both of them is there really is no wrong answer. Like, that person is much more focused on profitability. The CEO happens to be a phenomenal sales machine, and is a force where they're able to win a lot of business from the founder. Now, at some point, though, the amount of revenue you lose will generally be equal to what the founder brings in. And so you'll start having growth that will stall based on that strategy, which means at that point they might invest in sales and marketing, or they might just have a great business that's highly profitable, but it's not going to scale to a huge company. The other company is a very different strategy. They're building a leadership team. They're investing in sales and marketing. They really want to figure out how they go from 3 to 10. And in both scenarios, there's no wrong answer. There's a development company that's incredibly profitable. And when I talk to the owner, she's mentioned, look, I decided that I really wanted to focus on taking profits, and I wanted to use those profits and make investments outside of my agency. And in that scenario, she has invested in a lot of things outside of the agency, has a lot of cash for the agency, and that's a choice. I, with Rise, hovered between 0 and 5% EBITDA for many, many years. You always hear the typical agency is supposed to make 20% EBITDA. When you take all of my clients in aggregate, the EBITDA is 18%. Now, because I was investing anywhere between 13 to 18% more of my revenue into the business, I had a much larger sales and marketing budget. And so to me, I had a 20-year time horizon. I sold it in 16 years, so I never hit the 20-year marker. But I had a long-term vision where I wanted to fuel growth. And so I would put up really big sales numbers every single year. But my wife, for many, many years was like, couldn't we just take the revenue from one of the clients to just pay us, And I said, no, we're putting it back into the company. So, and then there are things that people don't realize. Like, people don't realize the importance of gross margin. And so if you have a really low gross margin, you don't have money to invest. So you don't actually have a choice. And so I have clients that are literally the exact same in size, do the exact same thing, but one has a really low gross margin, one has a really high gross margin. The one with the low gross margin lost money and they're not able to make all the investments they want to make. The one with the high gross margin is able to do all sorts of investments and build cash and build profitability. So gross margin is one of those secret items that people don't even know what it is. They don't know how to calculate it. And so as you get into organizing your chart of accounts, which I know you're going to want to talk to me about at some point, there's a lot of wisdom and a lot of learnings you can gain out of that.
Hey, it's Marcel here, and I hope you're enjoying the episode so far. If you are, then I want to encourage you to check out the Agency Profitability Toolkit. It's a free set of resources that we've put together to help agency owners just like you improve their profitability. It's full of free checklists, templates, and training videos, and has helped thousands of agencies get better at measuring the essentials of their business. So if you want to grab a free copy of that, you can head to parakeeto.com/toolkit or look for a link wherever you're watching or listening to this. With that, I want to thank you again for tuning in, and I'll let you get back to the episode. Yeah, well, it's funny. You took the conversation exactly where I was going to take it, which is that's the thing that no one seems to be, when they're talking about profitability, everyone's focused on their bottom line and aren't realizing that the foundation of profitability actually starts at the gross margin, which you and I are very aligned on our thinking around this. And I guess the next question and the place we should go is, well, let's talk about gross margin. What is it? How do you look at it? It might be different than how I look at it, but I think that'll be an interesting conversation if it is the case. Let's talk about it. What is gross margin? How do you define it? And how should agency owners be figuring out how it looks for them?
So the first thing I'm going to talk about is actually revenue. There are two types of revenue, in my opinion. There is gross revenue and net revenue. Gross revenue is, let's just say you're managing media and you manage 100 million in media and you get 10%, so you have $10 million in fees. So you'll hear a lot of times people talk about, I have a $100 million company. Well, that's your gross revenue, but your real revenue is what I call your net revenue, which is that 10 million.
Yeah.
So the reason why that's important is you need to understand what is your revenue so that when you analyze your gross margin, you're using the right denominator. So the next thing is there is a bunch of expenses, which generally are people, contractors, technology license, travel and entertainment, that all is focused on taking care of your customers. Mm-hmm. And so QuickBooks is a really good example. If you use QuickBooks Payroll, it defaults all of your payroll to one line item called wages. And so if you want to know what your gross margin is, 80% of your cost of service, which is the group of people who service your customers, are salary and payroll.
Yeah.
So you have to remove from that one line of wages and move them into the cost of goods sold area in your financial accounting system. And so when you hear the word cost of service, your gross margin is your net revenue minus your cost of service. And so then the most important number is not the absolute gross margin number, it's the percentage number. So what you want to do is you want to take your absolute gross margin number and divide that by your net revenue. And what I want is clients to be at 50%. Mm-hmm. Just to give you an idea, clients who joined us in 2021, their average gross margin in 2020 was 40%, and it moved up to 48% in the first 11 months of 2021. We're still gathering the December data, so we'll have the full year soon. So they're right around where I want them to be, which is that 50% marker.
Jon, I have a big smile on my face because you might be the first person that's ever explained that in exactly the same way that I explain. We use slightly different language. We talk about AGI, or agency gross income, as opposed to net, but it's the same concept, right? We have to strip out pass through. That's so critically important, because if we're trying to look at our business, to your point, as being $100 million business, when really it's 10 million, we can make some really bad choices in terms of how we invest. And then secondly, isolating that actual cost of earning that net revenue and isolating that. This is something that, I mean, we look at this month alone. We've been in the P&Ls of 4 companies through our audit process. Not a single one of them could get that number without having to do a bunch of math, or without having to go into the transaction level of a line item on their chart of accounts and parse apart what the proper allocation of, different softwares or different people or different other items inside their business are, to figure out what was the cost of earning that revenue for us and what was that margin. And my benchmark is exactly the same. Try to get to 50% on the P&L, which generally means on a project basis, you've got to shoot a little bit higher so that you can absorb utilization and things like that. But that's the same exact benchmark that we explain. This might, just because of this might be my favorite podcast episode I've ever done, Jon.
I love to hear that. And it's honestly, part of the success of Rise was our obsession with gross margin. By constantly evaluating that number and focusing on what do you need to do to improve the gross margin, gives you a huge edge.
Now,
and
sorry, I want to get really nerdy on this, and I want to start talking about some of the nuance, if you'll go there with me, Jon.
Absolutely.
All right, everyone listening, put your nerd glasses on. We're going into the deep end here. I want to start with the question I get all the time, which is, let's define the pass-through revenue, or the difference between gross revenue and net revenue. There's a lot of confusion around what should be getting stripped out beyond the obvious stuff like print budgets, media budgets, etc. When we start talking about freelancers and white label partners and some of these other vendors that we might be passing revenue through, how do you make the determination of what belongs in that pass-through kind of expense category and what we bring down into the agency and consider a cost of service?
So to me, anything where the revenue and the cost are equal is what I consider pass-through. So if you're licensing technology for $1,000 a month and you're charging the client $1,000 a month, I consider that pass-through. Anything where there is a gap, unless it is like, you're getting 10% of your media dollars, but it's like if you hire a contractor or a white label provider, that to me is something that's replaceable with a team member. And in those scenarios, to me, that's not a pass-through cost. So if, let's just say you're doing search engine optimization, you hire a white label SEO provider and you charge $1 million for SEO and the white label provider takes $800,000. Well, you're choosing not to build that internally. You're choosing not to hire people. And so in that opinion, that's not a pass-through cost. Like that means that you only get a 20% margin on that investment. Where if you, let's just say licensed, Moz, and you did a complete pass-through where you license Moz, you charge the client for the same license fee, that shouldn't show up on your revenue. That shouldn't show up in your cost of service. I move that into other income and other expenses on the income statement.
Interesting. That's a good way of looking at it. I like that definition. Mine is slightly different. The way I think about this is, are you responsible for the profitability of that revenue or not? So the slight difference is, I would consider the white label partner to be passed through, but I would consider the markup to actually be part of our net revenue. Because what I'm trying to figure out, and maybe this is just a difference in like the purpose of our service versus yours, but what I'm trying to figure out is what did it cost you to earn that revenue? What's the level of efficiency on that? So there's a very slight difference, but I think in both cases, you're going to get a much more accurate read, regardless of how you split that. But I'm curious, what are your thoughts on my take?
It really depends. Like if you say search engine optimization is core to your business and you're looking at using a white label provider to get you going, I don't look at that as a pass-through cost, because what you're going to do is you're going to look at your line items and start saying, well, what do we need to do to improve our margins? It's like, well, we only have a 20% margin on SEO. Maybe it's time that we bring that in-house. Or finally, we got our revenue up to $200,000 a month. What if we go and brought in a head of SEO and we, hired 4 people to do the work as opposed to paying this white label provider? In my mind, that is, that's the equivalent of hiring a contractor, and it's just you're managing the cost of the people. You're just doing it in a different manner.
Okay, that's where I think we're much more aligned. And it's the key thing that you said there was, is this a core service? And, I think another way of asking that question is this something that you otherwise would hire internally for if you had enough, enough volume to justify it, or, what have you? Or is this something that you just actually wouldn't hire internally for? So we're much closer on that.
Okay, so I think I'll agree with your answer in one regard. I generally have any ancillary, really small revenue items in the other income section of the income statement. The second it becomes substantial, that's when I would put that white label provider in the cost of service section and not considered as a pass-through entity.
I see. Okay, interesting. And now, so what I want to note on this is that neither Jon or I are necessarily wrong on this. The question that would have to be asked at the front end of any kind of determination of what the right approach is would be, what is the business model? What are we trying to measure? What are the answers that we're trying to get? And this is another thing that I love about you, Jon, is you deeply understand and believe in this idea of the way that we structure this data and do reporting. It all has to come back and be a byproduct of clarity on what the objective of that data, what the objective of that report actually is. Jon, we've talked about a lot of very interesting things. We've talked about, of course, your background. We've talked about the importance of gross margin and how that's kind of at the center of setting the foundation for agency profitability and success. We've talked about how to think about budgeting and working backwards from the goals of the organization. Do you have any other final words of advice for those that are listening that might just be at the start of their journey trying to figure out how to manage the numbers in their agency?
Yeah, I would say that the other big metric I want people to think about is looking at their sales and marketing as a percent of revenue. And, once again, as I mentioned before, what is important to the agency owner really drives what you spend your money on. But if you want to fuel your growth, I can tell you the vast majority of agencies don't spend a lot of money in sales and marketing. So, by spending more, by first fixing your gross margin and then looking to invest in sales and marketing, you're going to generate more leads than your competitive set, and you're going to fuel your growth. So it's a huge metric that I look at on a regular basis to see what you're doing to understand how important growth is to you as an organization.
Yeah. I think I want to double click on that last point before we wrap up, which is that, I think the common idea here is, okay, well, I'll just raise my prices every year to compensate for the fact that my people are getting paid more. And you and I both know that there are real constraints that make it such that you can't really do that without some consequences while maintaining utilization, without losing all of your clients. And so it's important to know that there are other levers that you might have to look at pulling to try and maintain your gross margin as all of these forces are constantly eroding that gross margin. You might need to look at ways of finding less expensive labor to do the work that your very experienced labor is doing that they might be kind of overqualified to do. You might have to find ways to do the same work faster or with less time investment such that your existing team can earn more revenue without increasing in cost. There are efficiencies that you want to be paying attention to, other metrics that you want to be paying attention to, so that price is not the only lever that you really have visibility into pulling in order to combat this force that is very real and everyone is feeling, especially right now as we see people getting 30, 40, 50, 100% raises year over year when they transition from your agency to go work at another brand and get paid twice as much for the same role. It's a crazy time, but raising price is often the first thing that people look at. And when they feel like, oh, that's not really an option for me, or I can't raise it enough, they kind of throw their hands up and go, I don't know what else to do about this. But when you have good visibility into the business, you realize that there's a lot of other things that you can do about it. And there are other levers that can be pulled. And I think that's a really important thing to drive home, is that having the visibility gives you the insight.
I couldn't agree more. And I could talk to you about not just like where the labor resides, but the org structure you put together and how many people report into your leaders, and making sure that directors are not doing managers' work and managers are not doing entry-level people's work. There's all sorts of things to think about in that regard.
So Jon, this has been a fantastic conversation. As usual, every time we talk, we just get super nerdy. So for those that are listening that want to follow the content that you're producing and the expertise you're putting out into the world, which you're doing a great job of, you've got some awesome webinars that you do and things like that. So I recommend, if you're listening, go check it out. Where should people follow you online?
If you go to my LinkedIn profile personally and connect with me, or you could go to the Ramsay Innovations, follow us on LinkedIn. Also go to ramsayinnovations.com. We have a blog where we're starting to produce content at a fairly regular basis.
Awesome. So for those of you listening, easy peasy, it'll be in the show notes. Just scroll down and all that information will be there. Jon's LinkedIn, Ramsay Innovations, social profiles, and website as well. And with that, Jon, I want to thank you very much for making time for us today. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. We really love being here.
Well, that's all for today's episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show if you want to make sure to be kept up to date when we release a new show. And of course, check out parakeeto.com if you want to dive deeper into our library of resources to improve your profitability, including our free Agency Profitability Toolkit. And of course, if you got some value from today's episode and you think somebody else might benefit from hearing it, be sure to share it with them or leave us a review. All of those things help us impact more agency owners. So with that, thanks again for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next episode.